Hello everybody, welcome to this hangout, which is an Ask Me Anything about loudness and dynamics Q&A. I'm probably not going to stick to that absolutely rigorously, but I do want to try and keep it fairly on track. So I think the first thing to do is to make sure that everybody can see and hear me. So if you can help me out by answering a question. I've got lots of questions that people have sent in, so I could either start by doing a brief introduction about loudness and dynamics, if it's something that people are new to, but if everybody who's here and watching this actually is kind of already up to speed with the topic and wants to get down to the nitty gritty, then I could just kind of go straight onto the questions. So maybe if you could just, if you're watching this in the Google event, the link is on the blog post on my website. Underneath the video, there's a comments section. If you could just put in the comments there, whether if you want the brief intro, type intro, and if you just want questions, type questions, and we'll see what kind of response we get. So I'm gonna keep an eye on that here, and if nobody replies, then I'll know that nobody's watching this. Actually, I should be able to see how many viewers there are somewhere, I think. Let me see if I can figure that out. Okay, yeah, 8-9 viewers. So would you like a brief intro, or should we get straight down to the questions? Here we go, got some replies coming in. Intro, please. From Thomas. I think since we're right on the correct start time, and I guess some people are going to roll in late, so maybe if I do a brief intro to kick things off, and then maybe some more people will have caught up. So what do I want to say? What is loudness? Loudness is just how loud stuff is, but in a technical term, when we're working with audio, it's actually quite difficult to measure. I think the first thing to say is that the peak level, the level that you get on the meters in your DAW, is completely useless for measuring loudness. And an extreme example of that would be if you compare a gunshot, where the waveform is a big spike at the beginning and decays very quickly to something very small, versus, say, a flute. If you matched the peak level of the waveform for a gunshot and a flute, you would find that the loudness of the gunshot is way, way, way down, and the loudness of the flute is right up near the top. So the flute would sound much, much louder than the gunshot. And you'll know about that if you've ever tried to mix drums and balance them with keyboards or sustained guitar riffs, even things like vocals. If you have the drums so that they're peaking good and high but not clipping, you have to turn all the other stuff way down, or you have to compress the drums to get rid of some of that peak information so that you can bring the loudness up. So peak level is hopeless for measuring loudness. When I first started working as a mastering engineer, I was trained to use VU meters, the needle meters, and I still use a plug-in emulation of one today. Those are a pretty good way of judging loudness. There's a more modern version, which is the RMS meter, that lots of people have and that you see in quite a lot of apps nowadays. That's also a pretty good way of measuring loudness. In the last 3 or 4 years, a new international standard has been agreed, the loudness unit, the LU. 1 LU is the same as a dB. It's similar to RMS, but it's weighted to take into account the frequency sensitivity of our ears. So when sounds are quiet, we hear less of the bass and treble, and we become more sensitive to bass and treble as the level comes up. And the LU meters take that into account when they make their judgment of loudness. And actually that reminds me of one of the questions that we had for the Q&A, which came from Sam and said, could I touch on the difference of accuracy there is between measuring loudness with RMS and LUFS? I was pretty happy with VU meters. I'm still pretty happy with VU meters. You know, I've been working as a mastering engineer for more than 20 years now, but you need to be careful. I mean, one thing about VU meters is they're much more sensitive to bass than they are to mid and high frequency signals. So you can have the needle pegging over because of some heavy bass in the signal and be fooled into thinking that the loudness is much higher than it really is. So I mean, there's a knack to reading all kinds of meters, but that applies particularly to a VU meter. RMS meters are less sensitive in that way, but the same thing still applies. You tend to see a bigger reaction on the RMS meter to a signal with lots of bass, which won't necessarily be reflected in our perception of the loudness, because the ear is most sensitive in the mid-range, the upper mid-range. That kind of a 2K is one of the most sensitive areas of the ear. So you can make something sound really loud by cranking up that EQ range. The RMS meter won't necessarily react that much. Correspondingly, you could pump up the bass and the RMS meter would show a big change in level. You wouldn't necessarily hear that as a big change in loudness. So I do feel that LUFS is a big improvement on RMS in terms of the way that we hear loudness. It's not perfect, and I don't think any computation or formula is ever going to be completely accurate. Our ears are incredibly complicated, and especially the way that our brain interacts with what we hear through our ears and kind of processes that sound, and the way that our perception affects things. It's so complex. To model that perfectly would be nigh on impossible. But, I mean, for example, every so often I test myself. As a mastering engineer, you're often judging loudness and balancing loudness, and I'll often want to have two songs that sound the same loudness. If I do that by ear and then I check the LUFS reading on a loudness meter, more often than not, we agree within a dB, sometimes as little as half a dB. So that to me says that the LUFS measurement agrees very closely with the way that I feel about loudness. So I do think it's a really good measure of loudness in that sense. So we can measure loudness now with an LU meter. The questions start coming in when we start looking at what's out there in the world. If you compare the LUFS reading of your mix with a mastered CD, you're going to find they have very different loudness readings. I'll just pause briefly and say that LU stands for loudness unit. LUFS means a loudness unit compared to full scale. So loudness units, you'll see measurements like -10, -16, -23. Those measurements are relative to the 0 dB full peak level that we have on all our meters in our DAWs and all the old audio software that we use. So if you see -10 LUFS, it means that the loudness is 10 dBs below the maximum possible peak level of the digital format. So if you compare, say, a raw mix, let's say unprocessed drums, the LUFS reading might be down at kind of -20, -18. The peak level might be around -6 or a little bit higher. Then you compare that with a pressed CD and you find that the LUFS reading on that is probably -10 or -8 or -6 or -4. And the peak level will be very, very close to 0, if not actually hitting 0 all the time. What's happened there is that the people who mixed and mastered the CDs have chosen to make the recorded level on the CD, the recorded loudness, very loud. That's fine up to a certain point. You can push the loudness up, and then you get to the point where your signal will start hitting 0, the peak level will start hitting 0, and you're going to get clipping distortion. At that point, you have to use some kind of processing, so you use things like limiters and compressors, soft clipping hardware or software, so that you can lift that loudness level higher without causing clipping distortion in the digital domain. That's also okay for a while, but there comes a point, which in my opinion is about -10 to -8 LUFS, where if you push the loudness any higher, you get more detrimental effects than you do beneficial effects. You know, everybody understands that we think that louder is better, but only when you've got unlimited headroom. When you come up against that hard ceiling, digital ceiling, pushing the level higher involves compromises to the sound, and whether those compromises are acceptable or not is a personal issue, and it's kind of the root of the whole issue of the loudness wars. Because what we've seen over the years is people trying to make CDs louder and louder and louder in order to compete with other people or to sound better, is the hope, than anything else that is out there. And I think the last thing I want to say as part of the introduction is that the loudness wars are a fact. Measured loudness levels are creeping up on CD. The loudness is getting closer and closer and closer to that peak level. But there's never really been much point in any of that, because loudness, we don't have control of loudness as the people who record and mix. We have control of the loudness in the digital file, but when it gets played back, people have volume controls. So people have always adjusted their own listening level to whatever they're comfortable with. FM radio has adjusted loudness since forever. They squash the sound further and even everything out in order to maximize signal quality in areas where the signal strength is low. And these days, broadcast formats, TV is legally controlled in the US, and everywhere in Europe has signed up to a new set of agreements. It's managed online. If you go to YouTube, if you go to Spotify, if you go to iTunes Radio, if you go to Pandora, if you go to Beatport, all of these places, because the number one complaint amongst listeners is changes in level, having to keep adjusting the volume control, all of these people want to manage loudness. They want to make it consistent for the listener to give you a good user experience as a radio listener or a TV listener or watching or listening to a streaming service online. So that means we don't have any control over the loudness. If you make your music super loud on the CD, it will get turned down. If you choose to make it quieter, it will get turned up to a point. So my feeling is that these days, the issue is not about being louder than everybody else. I don't think that was ever really the issue, but these days it genuinely is a pointless exercise. The question is, how do you sound great at the loudness that has been specified for you by one of these broadcast systems, these replay systems? And I've thought of one other thing I want to say as part of the introduction. I talked about the pushing the loudness up against the peak level. The most common question that people give me is, how loud should they master their music? How loud should they make it? There definitely is an advantage to achieving a certain level of loudness. There are actually parts of the process of making things loud that can be beneficial in terms of moving from a mix to a master, in helping something translate on lots of different playback systems. But the key issue is the dynamics, and the question is, how do you measure those? Dynamics are the variability of the sound. Constant tone has no dynamics. It never changes. It's completely undynamic. A raw, unprocessed drum sound or something like a gunshot is an incredibly dynamic sound. Human speech is very dynamic. They have a lot of variation in the loudness in comparison to the peak level of the waveform. And that's the key factor you want to keep an eye on, in my experience. It's sometimes called the crest factor. None of these names are strictly correct in a technical sense, but crest factor describes the difference between the peak and the loudness. So if your peak level is near 0 and your LUFS reading of your music is -10, then you have a peak to loudness ratio, they call it, of 10 dBs. If your music is up at -6, there's only a 6 dB ratio. So the closer the loudness gets to the maximum peak level of the signal, the lower that peak to loudness ratio, the PLR or the PSR for the short term ratio, gets. The more dynamic, the larger that value gets. So an unprocessed drum kit just recorded and mixed might have 14 or 16 dBs peak to loudness ratio. And that's a key concept, I think, for you need to understand it, you need to measure it so that you know what's happening to your audio, and so that you can get great results with loudness. So that's the end of my brief introduction, and I'm happy to go back to any of those points. Maybe the first thing I should do is just ask if we have any questions about what I was just saying. One thing I can do is I can share the Hangout link with you guys, because we have, how many people do we have in the Hangout at the moment? There's only 4 of us here, so 5 or 6 more people can join in if they would like and talk to me live. And while I'm doing this, maybe the rest of you could help me out by tweeting out a link to the Google event excuse me, for this Hangout, or putting it on Facebook, sharing it with your social media circles, so that if anybody else out there is interested, they can come and take part as well. So the link for the Hangout is this one here. So I'm going to paste this in the comments on the event page. Anybody who would like to jump in can click on that link. What I would say is only come in if you actually have some questions and would like to chat to me, because that gives other people an opportunity. And maybe if we talk, and once we've kind of finished our conversation, if the Hangout is full, if there are more than 10 people, maybe if you can drop out so that somebody else could come back in. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Ian is asking if there is going to be a replay of this available. The answer is yes. Pretty much as soon as it's finished, you'll be able to start watching it again from the beginning. Okay, so we already have a couple of questions here. If it's okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to the questions that have been asked here, because I have a bunch of questions that people have sent me in advance, and I want to make sure those are answered for the people who emailed me their questions. So I'm going to go to that list now. Wow, 45 viewers already. Hey guys, drop some comments in the comments box. Tell us where you're watching, where you are. Be great to know who you are. So I've answered Sam's question. I had a question from, I apologize, I'm going to mispronounce a load of people's names tonight, but I think that's Nirsa, but I did send him or her an invite, so I'll hang on and see if they get here. So Rusty says, I'd like to ask if you think that getting measures of the music in the range of -7 to -4 RMS would be overcompressed. He's using the Blue Cat DPMP meter. When I aim for -10 to -8, the final master sounds obviously quieter than the competition. So I think perhaps the first thing to say is that my recommendation is that you don't go lower than a peak to loudness ratio, a short-term peak to loudness ratio of 8 dBs, ever. Translating that into other terminology, if you use a VU meter and you have it calibrated so that 0 VU is at -10, when you're mixing and mastering, you allow that to peak a couple of dBs higher. That means there's 8 dBs difference between the peak and the loudness as measured by the VU meter. Or if you're using an LUFS meter or an RMS meter, if the LUFS or RMS is kind of -10 to -8 and the peak is up at 0, again, you've got that difference of 8 dBs between the peak and the loudness. And that's based on my experience. When I started mastering, the VU meter was calibrated at -14 for OVU. And over the first 10 years or so that I was mastering, it got to the point where the masters that we were seeing out in the world were increasing loudness to the point where I felt I had to recalibrate that VU meter. So I recalibrated to -12 and to -10. So 0 on the VU is -10 RMS or LUFS. They're all roughly equivalent if the EQ of the signal is balanced. So you're basically saying if the needle is peaking up to +2, that's when it's calibrated to -12, you've got 10 dBs peak to loudness ratio. When it's calibrated to -10, you've got the 8 dBs that I mentioned. And that was the point around about the year 2000 where I stopped. I made a personal decision that I wasn't interested in having my masters compete with that increasing level anymore. But watching what was happening in the world, the level of other masters kept going up, so that, yeah, by the time you had Death Magnetic by Metallica showing up in 2008, that had loudness levels, RMS levels up near kind of -4, and since then it's gone even louder. In my opinion, once you go below 8, it's all downhill. I have this concept that I still keep meaning to do a blog post on, of the loudness cliff. You know, if loudness is this cliff, this mountain that we want to all climb. We all want to be up there with everybody else towards the top of the mountain, and you're climbing up there. You can go up and you can go up and you go up, and everything's fine, and it gets harder and harder and harder to get to the top and get any further, and then suddenly you fall over the cliff on the other side. And for me, the quality just starts to deteriorate. It depends on the genre, it depends on the mixing and recording processes that we use to get there. Some stuff can be pushed harder than others without blatant damage. But for me, most music, if it goes beyond a peak to loudness of 8, would sound better if it had more dynamics. And certainly by the time you get to 6, which is pretty standard in the pop and rock world. If it goes beyond... okay, somebody else is coming to the Hangout. So I can hear myself bouncing back. Let me just check who that was.
That was Zach.
Hey, Zach. Nice to see you. Yeah, so when you guys come into the Hangout, if you can mute yourselves, that'd be really helpful. Obviously, unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. So, loudness cliff. So yeah, to get back to that question that Rusty asked, in my opinion, RMS of -7, -4 is probably going to be detrimental. It would probably sound better with more. And yes, when you compare it to the competition, you're going to be several dBs lower than some of the loudest stuff that's out there. But I go back to what I said in the introduction. In the real world, does that really matter? It doesn't matter online. It doesn't matter on Spotify or YouTube or iTunes Radio. I know it doesn't matter if you get broadcast on radio or TV. It doesn't matter if you get played in somebody's player, because they're just going to adjust the level. It probably doesn't matter on most people's personal media players, because loads of people use, Apple Soundcheck on iPods, or replay gain, or some other way of evening out the levels. Because if you have a music collection that spans maybe 20 or 30 years, if you've got stuff from the 60s and 70s, there's music in there that's 6 or 8 dBs quieter than the stuff that's coming out these days. And it's really annoying to have the levels leap up and down like that. So most people want that problem solved somehow. So it all comes down to perception. It all comes down to this belief that you have to be louder than anybody else in order to compete. Or in order to sound good. And that, in my opinion, is a myth. I have not yet found a genre where really high levels of loudness are required as part of the sound. Everybody says, oh, EDM needs to be crushed. And keep an eye on my website, because I'm going to be doing a video in the next week or two that I think demonstrates really clearly that's just not the case. You can get the sound of any genre, even R&B and hip hop and all these kind of genres where that super dense, super saturated sound is really common. You can achieve that sound without pushing the loudness up, and therefore you can improve on that sound by using the extra dynamics that are available to you. Especially when you think, let's just imagine that you master your music so the RMS is the loudness is up near -6, so you've got 5 or 6 peak to loudness ratio in your music. The replay level of YouTube is roughly -13 LUFS. So they're going to say, okay, your music is at -6. We want to play it at -13. So we're going to turn it down by 7 dBs. So there will then be 7 dBs of wasted headroom above that master that could have been used. So for me, that's a wasted opportunity. You want to be loud enough. I can talk about this more later if people want. You want to be loud enough so that they have room to turn your music up enough to match everything else without applying any extra processing or not being able to turn it up to prevent clipping, and therefore your music ends up being quieter than everybody else. But even on the most, Spotify is the platform with the highest replay level of -11 LUFS roughly. They use limiting, but even by today's standards, you've still got 11 dBs or 10 dBs at least difference there between the loudness and the peak that you can use. And a peak to loudness ratio of 10 dBs these days is high. The highest examples in kind of pop, in mainstream genre you can think of recently are things like Uptown Funk, Get Lucky, Happy, those all have about 8, 9, maybe 10 dB peak to loudness ratio. So all of those would sit really happily on Spotify without any extra processing. And they would be turned down by a couple of dBs on YouTube. iTunes Radio uses a lower level. They use -16 as their level. So you would have some wasted headroom there. But most people would probably say that's a worthwhile compromise to not have the levels change on the other platforms. So yeah, I think those levels are too loud. They're not going to compete with everybody else. But for me, I say, so what? One of the first things that happens when people come to me for mastering is I say, how loud would you like this? Can you give me some references? And if they suggest something that's too loud, I say, in my opinion, that's louder than you need to go. I think the music is going to suffer if you push it that loud. If that's what you want, you should probably try, working with somebody else. I think you'll get a better result. I just don't enjoy working on pushing music that loud. And the response I usually get is, well, show us what you would do anyway. So I master it the way that I would master it, with that minimum of 8 to 10 dBs of peak to loudness ratio. And I get one of three, some people at the point where I say, I don't want to master it that loud, go, thanks, we respect that. And they go off and work with somebody else. And then probably they recommend some of their friends who want more dynamic masters, and I get some work further down the line. So that's a good result. If I do the example, a small proportion of people go, no, you're right, that's not loud enough. And they go somewhere else. But I think something like 75, 80% of people say it sounds fantastic, and that's plenty loud enough. They don't mind that it's not as loud as the reference. And especially if I give them a comparison where I do make it as loud as the reference, they can make that comparison. They can hear it for themselves. If anybody is in this situation who's watching this call, my suggestion is just do those two versions, do a loud version and a quieter version, import them into iTunes, enable sound check, which will even out the levels, and then play them back to back. They'll play back at the same level, which is that kind of real world scenario that you get on YouTube and everywhere else. But you'll hear the more dynamic version right next to the less dynamic version. And people almost always choose the more dynamic version. Because it has extra punch, it has extra space, it has extra life in the sound. So yeah, that was quite a long answer to that question, but hopefully that answers it. We've got some more people coming into the Hangout. Let's just see who you guys are. Joe, welcome. Oh, Zach, we already knew about, and Thomas. Nice to see you guys. Did any of you guys have a question that you've already sent to me by email? No, I don't see anybody nodding, so I'll carry on with I'm going to go through the questions that were sent, and then hopefully we'll have some time to take some more questions from people. So Antonio had a question. He says, have you listened to recent songs by Drake, like Hotline Bling? I'd like to hear your overall opinion in regard to the balance and the kick drum sound. It's so heavily distorted and sustained with a lot of sub, like a lot of hip hop. I don't know if it's a mixing decision or could it be the master. Arguably, it's just how incredibly loud it is, or is it just that it's making things sound worse? So I think Drake is an interesting example because he does have that really bassy, subby, distorted, saturated sound. But actually, the levels on his stuff are nowhere near, well, they're relatively conservative, especially in the hip-hop genre. I was measuring some just the other day, and it's more like 7 dBs, sometimes 6 dBs peak to loudness ratio, so it's on the loud side. But in comparison with, say, somebody like Kanye West, whose last album, I think, had 4 at the most, and in some cases the difference between the peak and the loudness was only 3 or 2 dBs. I mean, it's super distorted. In fact, maybe I should give you a demonstration of that. Let's see if we can do this. In theory, okay, I'm going to share the desktop. Kanye West. There it is. So you could see the meters over here pegging. I had those VU meters calibrated at -10, and they were just... Now this here is my new plugin, Dynameter, which was just released last week. It measures this thing, the peak to loudness ratio that we were talking about. So I hope you guys can see this. The dotted line here, I have this, there are a set of presets where you can choose the kind of dynamic effect that you're going for. I have the limited preset here. It's the most aggressive setting, and it recommends a minimum peak to loudness ratio that I've been talking about of 8 dBs. You can see that's got to be 4 there for Kanye West. Now if I go to YouTube and play Hotline Bling, so you can hear that also has this really saturated sound that kind of hip hop and R&B, a lot of it has. The kick drum is distorting. His vocal is quite clean. So to answer the original question, in my opinion, the choice about the way this song sounds was probably made in the mix stage rather than the mastering. I think the beat has been processed to sound like that, and then the vocals have gone over the top clean. But just look at the meter here. You can see, I mean, it's in the red, right? The dotted line is the 8, the minimum that I suggest, and you can see that at some points it's gone down to kind of 7. So like I say, he's on the loud side of what I would recommend. But in comparison to the Kanye West track, it's much more dynamic. It's at least twice as dynamic. The Kanye West song is more distorted than the Drake song, but not all of them are that distorted on that album. I wonder if I can get all of the lights here on YouTube, because then you'll hear and be able to see the effects of the normalization onto this management of the loudness that I'm talking about, where they get played back at the same level. Now, I'm sure you're all distracted by Rihanna, but in the meantime, you can see there, look at the difference in the dynamics between Kanye and Drake. I think that demonstrates that this track here was mastered much louder into the video soundtrack, but when YouTube plays it back, that loudness difference is almost gone. There's a dB or 2 difference there. YouTube's loudness balancing algorithm is not perfect. Neither is Apple's Soundcheck. None of these ones are. But the songs get played back at a similar level, and it's not a predictable level. Let me go back to the Hangout so I can talk to you guys again. They need to fix that tunnel thing. So I've completely lost my thread where I was... Okay, so it was Antonio asking about the Drake songs. In my opinion, the sound of the Drake song was done in the mix, not in the master. In my opinion, I'm actually quite happy with that, personally. You know, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of massively distorted stuff, but I think it suits that song. It kind of suits the mood and the atmosphere he's going for, and he's achieved it, and he's kept those dynamics. If you cranked those two songs on a club PA at similar levels, in comparison, the Kanye West sounds constrained. It sounds held in, whereas the Drake song is going to have far more punch and impact to it. And the vocals in particular, I think, come across much better. So I don't think that in the Drake's case, what you're hearing is the result of the mastering. Whether it is in Kanye's case or not is really interesting. I would kind of love to see into his studio and know what his masters sounded like before they were mastered. Was all that all this distortion and everything already there? I suspect maybe it was. I think maybe he's just cramming everything up in the mix to the max and not really caring about the distortion. But yeah, I can't tell you that for certain. So now that you've seen Dynameter, the new plugin, you've got an idea of how one way that I'm judging loudness. You know, I've always worked with a VU meter, and a VU meter kind of tells you the same thing in a different way. If you have the VU meter hovering around the 0 mark, and you know that your 0 is calibrated at, say, -10 below the maximum peak level, you can figure out what the difference is in terms of when the needle pushes higher, the loudness is pushing higher, the difference between the loudness and the peak is less, so you're reducing that peak to loudness ratio. The thing I like about the way that Dynameter presents things, and obviously it was partly inspired by the TT meter that I'm sure a lot of you have seen, is that it shows you when things are dynamic, it looks bigger, and when they're crushed, it looks smaller. So it gives you a really clear visual indicator, and those guide bars, I won't switch back now, but the dotted lines that ran down the screen, you can immediately see when you've pushed the PSR, peak to signal, the peak to loudness, the short-term peak to loudness ratio, lower than your target, when you're reducing the dynamics more than you want to. And you can choose your own values. There's 4 presets that come with it: wide, balanced, competitive, and limited. So if you want to master music with more dynamics, you can choose one of the versions that's a higher PSR rating. You could also choose any number you like. You can type any number you like into the meter, and so you could choose to match stuff that you measure that might have a PSR rating of 6, or you could go even wider. And for me, it's a really nice one, and especially being able to zoom in and out. You know, I didn't entirely create it for me, but definitely the plugins that I'm making are things that I want to use myself in a mixing and mastering situation. And I just find that a really intuitive way of keeping an eye on what the dynamics are doing. Excuse me, I need a sip of water. And Hans has asked why I've used the PSR, the short-term peak to loudness ratio, instead of something called LRA, the loudness range. I am going to switch back again so I can show you those meters again, because I told you in the introduction that loudness is measured in these loudness units. There are 3 types of loudness unit. There's the momentary loudness, which varies very quickly, a bit like the peak level. There's the short-term loudness, which is kind of smoothed over a few seconds, which is what I'm using for Dynameter. There's the integrated loudness, which is over a whole song or a whole piece of audio. So if I switch back briefly so that you can see those. And we've lost the graph that okay, so I'll play a little bit more audio just briefly so that you can.
Late night when you need my love. Call me on my
so I have the LCAS meter here set to display the short-term loudness, and in the settings you can choose which one you want to see. It's also showing the integrated loudness up here, which is the loudness over. You can see the short-term, the graph is wobbling up and down, the meters are moving, the loudness varies.
These days, all I do is wonder if you.
Whereas the integrated loudness is an overall value for. So what I just played has an overall loudness of -13.7 LUFS. I wonder whether the peak level is higher. Anyway. But you can also choose, like I say, you can show the momentary loudness and you can show the integrated loudness. So the pink one there is the momentary loudness. You can see, let me zoom in on this. You can see that varying up and down, and then the integrated loudness is this blue line here, which is just an overall value that changes much more slowly and reflects. So you could have something that had some bursts of much louder material and the integrated loudness wouldn't change that much. You can also measure with a loudness meter like this something called the loudness range, the LRA, and that basically means how often is the signal really loud and how often is it quiet, and what is the difference between those. So if you imagine maybe a heavy metal song that is basically full tilt the whole way through, it will have a very low loudness range. If you imagine something like a symphony orchestra where you have a very wide variation in the loudness levels of the signal, everything from a tiny little whisper of just violins shimmering in the background up to, you know, okay, so Star Wars came out today, right? So, you know, the Imperial March with it's full on. the difference in loudness between those things is very high, so you have a much higher loudness range. So the question was, why am I using this difference between the loudness, the peak, and the loudness level rather than the loudness range? And the answer is, I just find it more useful for the very reason that I just described. The loudness range depends on the genre. So let's say you had a metal song that had a very quiet introduction and then it got really loud. That would have quite a high LRA reading, loudness range reading. That's telling you about the song. It doesn't tell you how crushed the loudest moments are or how dynamic the softest moments are, which is what I'm really interested in. So the loudness range it's still valuable and it's still very useful, but it was developed more for use in broadcast than it was in music production. Whereas I'm just going to switch back so you're not staring at my screen again. Whereas the peak to loudness ratio, the PSR, I've been measuring that one way or another the whole 20 years that I've been mastering. Initially I was measuring with a VU meter, later on I was measuring it with an RMS meter, now I'm measuring it with a dynameter. It's always been, at the loudest moments, how high am I going to push it? How close to zero am I going to push the loudness, and what effect does that have on the sound? How does it change the sound? So that's, the reason I chose that value is just that for me is one of the most significant, most important properties to pay attention to when you're mastering. So I hope that answered your question, Antonio. Now I'm just going to see who we have. I know a few more people have been joining the Hangout. Let me just see whether anybody who... No, we still don't have that question from Nirsa. So now let's take a slightly different tack. Martus, I hope I pronounced your name right, wanted to know, when I'm mixing, do I mix with a final dynamic range in mind, or does it just happen during the mastering? So there are kind of two answers to that. Just let me have a slug of coffee. That's getting nice and lukewarm now. I do and I don't. One of the great things about being a mastering engineer is because you know exactly what's happening in the mastering stage, you know the things that you don't have to worry about when you're mixing. So, for example, I don't have to worry too much about the overall level of bass and treble. I want to get them close enough, but I know that I'm going to fine tune those in the mastering stage, so I don't worry too much. And it's similar with loudness. I'm not overly concerned with the overall loudness or dynamic range. I don't work with lots of bus compression on my stereo output, although people do, and that's perfectly fine if that's how you like to do things. I certainly don't work with a limiter or any multiband compression on the stereo output. So I'm thinking about the compression of individual elements within the mix and the balance and the EQ balance and all of those things. And I know that I'm going to deal with the final loudness at the final stage. Now that's me with my relatively conservative mastering levels. I mean, there are purists out there who would say that the minimum value of PSR 8 that I'm suggesting, which by the way for TT meter users is the same as DR8, more or less, they would say that's outrageously low. I'm already, they would accuse me of being a perpetrator of loudness. I don't think that's the case. But there are people out there who would argue for a minimum PSR of 14 or certainly 10 or 12 dBs. But then there's everybody else out there who's, mixing and mastering everything to maybe a -6 PSR. The loudness levels are right up there, and the difference between the peak and the loudness is really crushed. I mean, you saw what Kanye was doing. That's a really extreme example, but just a couple more dBs and you're in Taylor Swift territory, you're in Adele territory. The new Coldplay album is nearly that loud, and it's covered in distortion, sadly. If that's your final goal, then I think you need to be thinking about it from the very beginning. You need to be thinking about it in terms of the sounds that you record. You need to be thinking about it in terms of the arrangement of the song. You certainly need to be thinking about it in terms of the mix, because if you make a super dynamic mix and then try and crush it down to those levels at the final stage, it's very likely to be a disaster. Whereas if you have that in mind the whole way through and work all your way through, so the perfect example that I like to give in this case is something like Skrillex. Not his last couple of albums, but back around the time of Bangarang, those kind of releases, he was achieving incredible levels of loudness with relatively, I mean, there are side effects, there are always compromises when you push the loudness that loud, but it's not covered in distortion, it's not pumping or, you know, just sounding wildly wrong. It's just got a very dense, very dense sound, you know, and the kick and the snare have almost no, they don't go ooh, they just go ooh. It's a kind of, it's almost flat, the sound. But and that's, I think, is a production decision, you know. That's something that that's why I'd be fascinated to know about All of the Lights, that Kanye track, you know. Was that smashed in the mastering stage, or was it smashed in the mixing stage? You can never tell. So for me personally, I don't agonize too much about loudness. I always have VU meters and dynameter there. It's a kind of a habit that I just have them there. They're part of the way that I work. So if I saw a really high VU level when I wasn't expecting it, or if I saw a very low PSR reading on dynameter, that could be a clue that maybe something was happening that I wasn't aware of. Maybe I was clipping something somewhere, or overdriving a mic pre, or, you know, one of the plugins wasn't functioning correctly, or something wasn't set up right. But providing I'm not seeing those things and it sounds good to me, I'm comfortable. If I was somebody who was working to achieve those super hot levels at the end of the chain, then I would be paying a lot of attention. And I think the key, if that's your goal, is to do is stages. So there's another question later on where someone asks, can I find it? No, I can't find it. Somebody was asking. Oh, well, somebody was definitely asking. The limiter was giving them 6 dBs or more of gain reduction, and they wanted to be able to achieve higher levels, but without the limiter working that hard. And the answer to that question, for me, is to use some compression followed by some limiting. So I tend to use compression with slow attack times to control the body of the sound, the bulk of the sound, with quite low ratios, 2 to 1 ratio. And then you can use a limiter to catch the transients. You've got a long attack time, so the transients get through. The longer term aspects of the sound, the body of the sound, are controlled by the compressor, and then the limiter comes in and shaves off the transients, which is what they were designed to do and what they can do very transparently. So you might still see 3 or 4 dBs of limiting in that case, but it's less likely to be damaging. Whereas if you put a completely uncompressed signal into a limiter and whack 6 dBs of gain reduction onto it, the chances of it sounding good are pretty low. So that's what I mean by stages. You have a compressor and then and of course prior to that I would have had compressors in the mix to control the dynamics and to manage the dynamic range of everything in the mix to achieve the best result. So again, in that sense, I am thinking about the dynamics at the mix stage with a view to gradually reducing it down. And if you want to achieve those really extreme results that we were talking about, the really high levels of loudness, you need to perform that process to the nth degree, you know, really go to town with that kind of workflow. So I hope that helps answer that question. I'm going to pause while I have another slurp of coffee. Does anybody in the Hangout, or would anybody want to ask any kind of follow-up questions to the things that I've been talking about so far? Let's have a look through some of the comments here. Okay, Jason's got a good question, which I'll come to in a minute. Oh, there's actually lots of questions. So my friends who are in the Hangout and who've been reading this stuff, rather than me sit here and read it all, Are there any kind of questions or follow-ups to what I've been talking about that you think it would be good to address? No, Marat is shaking his head. Yeah, Zach, let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear?
Yep.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm using that dynameter, and I did a track at 10, and then around 8, 9 courses back to 10. And then in Wavelab, when we do the generate loudness in the BWF section of the metadata, it's coming up when you reopen it into the... Sorry, I'm hearing myself double. I've got a lot of latency. So,
sorry. Oh, I know what that is. Hang on. I need to disable that. Try that. Is that better?
Hello. Oh, that's loads better. Brilliant.
Sorry.
Okay. Right. Okay. So I had it coming up on your dynameter. It's 10, and nice and healthy, and then occasionally dropping to like 8 or 9, perhaps for the choruses, then back up to 10. Then when you do the generate loudness, when you tick that box in Wavelab for the metadata, for the BWF, I believe it is, when you reopen the file, it says that it was doing about -12, -13 as the loudness range. And I'd have expected it to be around the 10 or 9, maybe as a compromise between the, being at 10, then jumping to 8. You'd have thought it'd be on average around 9. But it was coming up as 13, so I wondered if you've noticed this yourself as well. Perhaps you kind of answered it with that LRA section you spoke about earlier.
So I can't give you a categorical answer because I haven't used that function in Wavelab myself. There are several options as to what Wavelab might be measuring. If it is using the LUFS loudness measurement and generating the LRA that I was talking about, that number's not going to really have anything to do with the PSR rating that Dynameter shows. So it wouldn't surprise me if those two measurements didn't show up. It might be just judging loudness in terms of RMS, but I would be surprised if it's a later version because I think they've got pretty much full loudness support in Wavelab. What it might be showing you is the PLR. So Dynameter displays this thing called PSR. So it's the short-term peak to loudness ratio. So it's the peak to the short-term loudness. If instead you measure the integrated loudness and do the peak to the integrated loudness, what you typically find is that range is a bit bigger because the integrated loudness, like I was saying when I was showing you the loudness meter, let's say it's kind of ticking along at -12, and then you have a section that's kind of goes up to -8 for a bit and it goes down. Because that section is short, the integrated loudness reading, which is kind of like an average reading over the whole length of the song, it might increase a little bit because of that short loud section, but it's not going to leap up to 8. So typically when you look at the PLR, the integrated peak to loudness reading of a whole song, and compare it with the minimum PSR, which is the minimum short-term peak to loudness, the PSR tends to be smaller. So if you had 8 to 10 in Dynameter, it wouldn't surprise me if the PLR was a couple of points higher. So I suspect that might be what you're seeing. It's either that it's the loudness range, which actually is measuring something different, or it's the overall peak to loudness ratio rather than the PSR. And that actually is one of the reasons that I developed Dynameter, because there's a bunch of plugins that will currently tell you the PLR, the overall peak to integrated loudness difference. But that can be a problem because you could have something ticking along at 10 dBs and then it could suddenly leap up by 6 dBs and be horribly aggressive and distorted during those loud moments and then drop down again. And the PLR measurement, the overall peak to loudness, wouldn't give you a clue that that was happening. Whereas when you look at Dynameter, when you get to the end of it and you can see the kind of the graph of the whole song, you can see, well, most of the time it was like this, and then for a short section it crashed down to that. You can even get a timecode reading for it to kind of jump back in your audio and go, okay, that's the bit I want to listen to, and you can listen to it and see whether it's becoming too distorted. So Yeah, and that's I can say that's why I developed dynameter, because I feel that the PSR, the short-term peak to loudness, is the thing to really pay attention to when you're making these decisions, rather than the overall peak to loudness ratio, because I think that can be deceptive. And the same thing applies to kind of the offline readings of the T meter. Those a single number to try and characterize the loudness of a song, I don't think it's adequate. I think you need more information, more detail, to kind of make the right decisions, or to be guided in the right directions. Because I don't believe it sounds ridiculous with me having all these meters and talking all this technical stuff. I don't. At the end of the day, it's what it sounds like, not what the numbers say. So you need to, your ears need to be the final judge. But does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm just going to say my battery is running out, and I've just lost my power lead. It stopped working, and so I might disappear. It's literally ticking down. But so, which one would you? I was currently using the integrated loudness, I suppose, because I'm sure that's what these normalization people use, isn't it? They take the integrated loudness and go, okay, that's -13, so we're going to turn it up 3 dBs to -10.
The honest answer is we don't know. If your battery runs out, you can catch up with this on the replay.
Okay.
But the measurements that I'm making of things like YouTube and Spotify and iTunes Radio, we're using the loudness standard because that's the best way of measuring loudness that we have. But exactly how, well, we know that they're not using those measurements because the loudness isn't consistent enough to reflect that. There are things where the loudness meter and our ears say that's too loud still, even after they've adjusted it. But their adjustment hasn't compensated adequately. So Apple definitely isn't using it. Soundcheck, who knows exactly how it works. Sometimes it produces some bizarre results. There's a U2 song that plays back about 3 or 4 dBs quieter than any of their other stuff. And something in the sound of that song triggers something strange in Apple's algorithm that means that the loudness management isn't as effective as it should be. Spotify uses replay gain that lots of people already know about. Replay gain is pretty good, but not perfect. Soundcheck is another thing. We don't know what YouTube is doing. So yeah, all of this stuff is just guidelines. It's not a kind of cast iron guarantee. I can't promise anybody that if they do this with dynameter or any other meter, they will get, X input won't necessarily give Y output, won't necessarily give the result they're expecting. But for example, another way that they could do it is they could measure the most loud point in a piece of music and adjust the loudness according to that. That would be another not entirely stupid way of designing a system to manage this stuff. So my advice to you is actually to do both. And there's going to be, I hope, a future update of Dynameter where we make that even easier. If you keep your minimum PSR above 8, so you know that we're not squashing it too much, that means that your music's not going to get turned down too much, and it means you're making the best use of the dynamics that are available to you, 8 to 10 PSR. The overall value, the PLR, best guess we have is Apple Music -16, YouTube -13, as we saw in that video there, and Spotify -11. So if you keep the overall peak to loudness ratio below 11, I don't think the level is going to be messed with significantly on any of those platforms. It'll get turned down a bit on iTunes Radio, but in a similar way to everything else. It won't get turned down much on YouTube at all, and on Spotify it should go through pretty much clean. So you should get, in that case, consistent. So you want to stay between those two values. You want to keep your PLR 11 or less, but don't go below PSR 8. And as I say, we've got some ideas of how to make that even more accessible to you in the Dynameter interface in future. Does that help?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, mate.
My pleasure. Anybody else want to jump in before I get back to the list of questions?
Hey, yeah. Do you hear me?
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah.
Just quickly a question regarding what's your take on the K meter and the whole study of that's been there. I saw the Amicas have a similar plugin that I've been starting using already. So meter plugs. Yeah. So what's your take on that?
So the K system, for anybody who hasn't come across it, is another way of measuring loudness, proposed by Bob Katz. And it's kind of a similar way to approach all of this. Again, I use my VU meter calibrated at -10. Bob suggests you use a K meter, which still uses some form of RMS to estimate the loudness. And he has K20, K14 and K12 from memory. Using K12 is roughly equivalent to having your VU meter set calibrated to -12 instead of -10. So it's a similar idea. He's saying choose the loudest you want to go as your reference point and don't go too far above it. So if you set your K meter to K12, 0 on the meter corresponds to a loudness roughly of -12 LUFS. And if you allow it to peak 2, 3 or 4 dBs above that at the loudest moments, hopefully you can see that that's going to work in a similar way to calibrating your VU meter to -12 and allowing that to peak 2 or 3 dBs higher. And again, because you're taking the loudness and then looking at how different it is from the peak level, indirectly you're paying attention to the peak to loudness ratio, to the PSR. So I think, I haven't actually tested this categorically, but I'm pretty sure that if you had a K10 on the K meter, and I don't know whether you can set that, but if you had a K10, I think that would be exactly equivalent to where I have my VU meter calibrated, which is at -10, which would give you that same PSR range, the same peak to loudness ratio that I'm talking about of 8 to 10 dBs. So K12 is just a dB or two lower than I would recommend. And I think Bob suggests you mix at K20 and then you master at either K14 or K12. Bob is one of those people who's more conservative than me about the loudness. I kind of feel like the numbers I'm talking about are objective in the sense that, yes, there are compromises if you push your music as high as PSR 8, or if you push the PSR as low as PSR 8, but I think often they're acceptable, and most people won't be upset by them. You won't. I don't think you're into damage territory. By the time you get down to PSR 6, I think you run that risk, and below PSR 6, I think for me, the music is always literally damaged. Of course, it's a matter of taste. For Bob, the levels that he chose with his K meter were lower because he wanted to encourage people to go even more dynamic. So yeah, I think the K meter is a good system. I mean, it's interesting because somebody asked me a specific question about it. I think in one of the comment threads when I was talking about dynameter on Facebook or somewhere, and I hadn't done the comparison specifically, so I fired up the meter plugs K meter and was trying to find how the two connected. And what did I decide? If you used K12, I think that was equivalent to Dynameter's competitive preset, which recommends a minimum PSR of 10. So Bob's K12 peaking a couple of dBs higher, i.e. 10 dBs difference between the peak and the loudness ratio. It's all the same stuff. It's just, for me, what Dynameter shows is that much more immediate and direct and intuitive, because you don't look at the loudness and kind of go, oh, where's that in relation to the peak and how does that, you just see it and you can just go, well, that's too low, I want to go higher. Or, so I think it, that's the, lots of people have said, oh, some people like the fact that it's very simple, and some people are like, well, why do I need this? And the answer is maybe you don't need it, but actually I think when you have it, it's just such a great tool. It's just so useful. It's like, I mean, my other plugin is called Perception. From the very first time of having that as a beta version, I used it on every mastering session I had, and it took us a year to get it released. And same with Dynameter. I've had a beta version of this, this really ugly version that just sat in a box in the corner of my screen originally. And I've used it on every mastering session since, because for me, it's useful. It's valuable and easy to use. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's perfect. Cheers, man. Thanks.
No problem. Pleasure.
Hey, Ian, I have a question. Okay, as we've been talking about this stuff over the past 1 to 2 years, I had a bunch of guys post songs showing me things that were lost. The guys are saying things are lost when we get into a smaller and smaller dynamic range of the whole song. And one of the things that I remember clearly that has stuck with me is emotion caused by volume changes, going from soft to loud. What other things can you think of off the head, real quick, that might be lost with a smaller dynamic range? Like as we get smaller and smaller, is there anything else you can think of? I mean, I really took it to heart and started making sure that as I did my crushed type mixes, that I actually added things in there that made you on purpose, like it affected you emotionally on purpose, like movements. Can you think of anything else that might be lost from this?
I mean, the thing that kind of, the first word that comes into my head is groove, which is kind of an old-fashioned word, but just, the thing that makes you want to dance. I think I've said before that, a beat is drums, and a drum is something that is quiet and then loud. And up to a point, the more you take away of that contrast, the less effective it is. I mean, anybody who's been to a gig or sat around an African drumming circle, or played a drum themselves, just knows that kind of, that pounding, that we're kind of, I mean, it's thought that drums are the most primitive form of music that mankind came up with, just tapping your knees and, beating a hollow log or all of those kind of really, it's very, very easy to make a percussion instrument. It's very, very natural. So it seems to me, makes sense to me that that's the most kind of primal, visceral element of music that there is. I guess maybe you could say that the human voice, singing is the other one that's kind of on a level with that. And both of those things are really intrinsically dynamic things. And anybody who's seen or heard somebody sing live, kind of just there in front of you, unamplified, acoustically, or if you've been to a concert and seen an orchestra and they play something like Bolero, where the drums just get louder and louder and louder all the way through, or you go and see, even something like a band with a stand-up bass, and some guy on a tea-chest, that kind of stuff, or somebody beatboxing live, where they're effectively using the voice as a percussion instrument. I just think all of those things, dynamics is almost all you have. There's often hardly any pitch. You've got the rhythm, but the rhythm depends on the dynamics. If you took a drum and you took all the dynamics out of it, you'd have no rhythm, because it would just kind of go, and that's what you hear on stuff that's really extremely processed. That's why I find it so frustrating with the whole EDM thing, because this is music that's designed to make people dance and to give you that lift, to give you that endorphin rush as it builds up to its peak. And if you're going to actually flatten that peak off and not have it, what people like Skrillex end up doing, and kind of, it sounds like what you're doing, is you're kind of faking the dynamics. You kind of take the dynamics away and then put stuff back in to try and make you think that they were there in the first case. And to me, it makes no sense. It's like, well, you have dynamics, just use the dynamics. Because I mean, in terms of music, how many dimensions do you have? You have pitch, you have timbre, the sonic quality of whatever you're listening to, you have rhythm, and you have dynamics. So maybe there's some more that I haven't thought of, but if on that basis, if music is a four-dimensional thing, if you take out dynamics, you just removed one of the weapons that you have at your disposal. If you use auto-tune, so you don't have natural pitch fluctuations, I'm all for working with limitations, I certainly believe that, but to me, it makes no sense. Now, the thing is, what we're talking about is recorded sound. So what works with a singer sitting in front of you in a room, what might move you to tears, might not work when you record it. and play it back through a phone speaker or even a decent hi-fi speaker, turned down. The whole recording, mixing, mastering process is about creating an illusion, making people feel as though the musician is there with you, but they're not. Microphone isn't an ear, tape isn't. There are so many artificial stages in between the original sound and us hearing it, mainly the loudspeaker, that you can't just stick a mic in front of something and record it with all of the original dynamics and all the rest of it and expect it to work. And that's where we have all our fun, because it's finding the tricks and the techniques and the strategies that enable us to get something that affects somebody emotionally in the same way that it might, or maybe even more than it would if the performer was just there. So, and as a mastering engineer, I'm managing dynamics all the time. I'm making stuff louder most of the time. Most of the mixes I get sent would benefit from being made a bit louder, and the process of making them louder, adding a little bit of compression, a little bit of limiting, and all the rest of it is beneficial, because it helps the end result translate. It means that it will work on an iPhone speaker and on a club PA and on a really good hi-fi speaker and in your car, whereas the raw signal maybe wouldn't have worked as well. That's my experience, and that's the exciting bit about doing the job, is making that happen. But like with everything, if you go too far, you start to lose something. And it's, anybody who's seen me talk before knows I'm all about, it's all about balance. It's all about finding the sweet spot. So you want to control the dynamics to the point where it translates and it works in that wide range of things, and it still achieves all of those emotional goals that you have, and it makes people want to dance and it makes people want to move. And you don't, but you don't want to go too far. There's that point in that there's too little, it doesn't work. Too much, it doesn't work. And then there's that place where it's perfect and it just does exactly what you want. And that's my goal when I'm recording, mixing, mastering music. And yeah, I think the risk is that as you strip out more and more of those elements, okay, so out of those four things, rhythm, you could say that quantization, the everything on the grid, is removing another one of those. You're not removing the element of rhythm, but you're removing some of the human element. It's loads of people talk about this, so I won't bang on about it. But and then I can't remember what the one that you're left with is. Well, timbre. So if you use sampled instruments, where the timbre of the note is far more consistent than a real instrument, and you don't have, suddenly you've got nothing left. You haven't got literally nothing left, but that's why it's so much harder. That's why nobody has yet recreated a symphony orchestra using samples and MIDI and stuff. People have got close, just like CGI has got close to simulating reality, but I've not heard a really convincing emulation, and I think, yeah, by all means, control one of those things. Use auto-tune as an effect, but don't use auto-tune and quantization and crush the dynamics out of it and use only sampled sounds. If you're going to use sampled sounds, maybe have some real percussion instruments in there as well to liven things up. And kind of getting off topic with the loudness thing, but yeah, I just kind of feel that dynamics is one dimension of that sound, and you need a certain amount of all of it to achieve the end goal. Does that what I suggested there of you? Does that sound fair to you? The idea that if you remove the dynamics and then you're doing stuff to you're kind of creating fake dynamics. Do you think?
I absolutely am creating fake or different dynamics. Absolutely, it's something that I definitely dove into because I wanted that emotion back, and I noticed that when I first started listening to EDM, it blew me away. Somebody got me on these big PA speakers and said, "Ma, check this out," and I got hit with this barrage of sound, and I was like, "Whoa, this is!" It was like, "What is this?" And then so I make a CD, and I'm jamming in the car, truck, whatever, and then Beat It will come on because that's one of my songs that I really like to compare stuff to, and there's a different life in Beat It when those drums come on. That kick snare hit, there's a breathing life, and even timbre over time, the fluid movement of timbre over time on that stuff, it's just a different beast. And I notice, like, the more you guys would talk about this, I go back in and I start listening for this and trying to, okay, how am I going to put this back in? And I notice I really like natural. There's a naturalness that I like, that I want. Like from vinyl records, there's a naturalness, but I also want that banging, And so that's my thing. Is I've been busting my butt to get a combination of that. But like I said, as soon as Beat It comes on, I mean, it's unquestioned. It's just I'm like a robot. Oh, okay, you got me, and
Yeah, I mean, he's the master, and I've got a mental blank on the guy who mixed Thriller.
Bruce Swedien.
Yeah, he used no compression at all on the drums, from what I remember, and there's very little mastering compression. And the original CD of Thriller was much more dynamic than the kind of the present day mixes that you hear. Was Beat It on Thriller, or was it one on the next album?
I think it was on Off the Wall, but whatever it was dope.
Yeah, I mean, it's, and plenty of dynamics, So my I don't know about challenge, but I'd be interested to know. I think if you're using processing and you're using lots of dynamic processing to achieve a certain sound, and that's the only way you can get that sound, and then you kind of build dynamics back in afterwards, I think that's cool. I think that's a valid way to work. I'm interested in the idea of keeping more of the original dynamics to begin with. I mean, I'm guessing you do that processing mainly with, kind of like loops and drums. You wouldn't. It's not like you're taking all the dynamics out of a vocal recording and then trying and putting them back in. Is that right? Am I understanding what you're doing? Maat, can you still hear me? Either I've frozen or you've frozen.
No, you're good.
Okay. Well, no problem. Yeah, it's I've lost my thread.
I got a question for you, going back to squashing dynamics.
Okay.
Could it also bring problem, because when you create width in a stereo image, the position in the 3D space is either a phase shift or a level change. So if you start squashing, you could actually affect how the position in the space of your elements is perceived by the user if you start squashing all the dynamics. So like, ping pong delays and things like that, that they play onto changing level, more the actual phase shift of this.
I think that can certainly happen if you don't have a link between the left and the right channels.
Yeah.
So, absolutely, if you have something kind of panned hard left and it gets more heavily compressed than the stuff on the right, that can affect the image of the stuff that's in the center, right? Because when the level gets pulled down on the left, use two hands, when the level gets pulled down on the left but not on the right, that's like you twisting the balance control. So that can make something that's meant to be hard center kind of move in that sense. And if in terms of phase shifts, I think that certainly is a possibility with analog gear, because pretty much everything causes some kind of phase response. If you've got the left and the right locked, I think that effect should be less. But one of the things that I notice about things that have very reduced dynamics is they feel like they have less space.
Yeah.
Especially when you compare them at the same level. And so I don't think that, for me, that's not the left-right position of the sounds, but it's kind of the front-back.
Yeah, also.
Yeah. And I mean, it's another case of kind of finding the balance. Apologies. Another case of finding the balance point of if you. One of the nice things to do with the drum kit is to compress the bus so that you've reduced the dynamics overall of the kit sound. And what happens then is you get more room sound, you get more of the reverb decay. So it can actually increase the feeling of space in the mix when you do that. But if you go too far, it somehow starts to take it away. And I think now, who is it? I'm going to steal somebody else's analogy here. Oh, it's Andrew Sheps. he's talking about a different issue. He's talking about data compression. And he says one way that he likes to think about data compression is, we've all seen those things where you have a paragraph of text on the screen and you remove all the vowels. So that it's kind of all of the, and we can still read it because our brain can fill in the gaps. It's one of those amazing things about the brain. However, after a while, it becomes really hard work. It's hard work to decode, basically, and we start to feel fatigued as a result. And that's his analogy for why lossy compression, data compression, is more fatiguing to listen to. And I buy that. But I would then extend his analogy and say that I think it also applies to dynamics. Our ears and our brains are evolved to decode sound in the natural world. And like I was just saying about what I was talking to Matt about, what we can achieve what our ears can achieve in terms of perception when we're in a space with a performer or listening to something. There's things like the cocktail effect where you can understand what somebody's saying at a busy party, even though your ears are being assaulted by everybody else's conversations. A combination of lip reading and processing of what's coming into our ears enables us to understand what they're saying, even though it's a really noisy environment. Things like that our ears can do in a natural environment and that our ears are naturally programmed to do. The challenge when you're recording sound is to preserve that so that we can perceive all of those things like depth and space and stuff that was in the sound originally. And I think dynamics is one of the important clues that help us do that. I think there are people who've done some research on speech intelligibility and discovered that, again, it's this case of a sweet spot. If you have record somebody with no compression at all, it gets quite hard to hear the quiet stuff that they say, and the loud stuff might be too loud, might cause distortion or be uncomfortable to listen to. It's quite hard to listen to that signal. A certain amount of compression makes the whole thing feel more consistent. It makes it easier to listen to. But I think you go beyond that and compress it dynamically too much, and it becomes harder to listen to again because some of the natural inflections and variations that are there in speech when we talk get removed. And I think that's kind of similar to what happens in terms of space and all the rest of it. I think, our ears are constantly listening for clues in the audio that we hear, and we interpret certain things, in terms of height, for example. What you find is that if you record a sound that's up here and moving down, there are notches in the frequency spectrum caused by the shape of our ear and the head, and those notches move depending on the height. So you can fake an effect of height in sound. That stuff like Q sound, that thing from back in the 80s, and all these kind of 3D audio things that you hear, they're all using tricks like that. So you're sending clues to the ear that suggest that the sound is up here or down there or behind you or whatever. And the more heavily we process, the more you auto-tune a voice, the less human it sounds, the less natural it sounds. The more heavily you compress a drum kit or whatever, the less natural it sounds. And up to a point that can be good, and beyond a point it's detrimental. It makes it harder for us to listen to and harder for us to process. So that's my personal opinion on what's happening there. So,
hey Ian.
Yeah.
Real quick, so that Andrew Shep's talk that you mentioned, I put a link over in the thread in the comments, but it's called Lost in Translation. He does a Google talk, and that's really cool to watch.
Yeah, thank you. It's really ironic. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with Andrew Sheps because he's such a nice guy, and he's really intelligent. He's great at speaking and putting things across, and he's doing great work, in my opinion, kind of making people like Google aware of the importance of quality in audio and the codecs that they use and all the rest of it. And then on the other hand, he mixed a whole bunch of albums that I hate the sound of.
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, I agree that talk is excellent. And he goes slightly off piece in one of the talks that I do, where he could the whole high res thing, because he kind of extends that analogy of the extra information into high res and gets into the whole stair step in digital audio argument. So you need to, even when it's somebody like him, you have to have your kind of radar active to make sure that what he's saying still makes sense. But yeah, I've heard him being interviewed and doing lots of talks, and I've really enjoyed it, and I've agreed with a huge amount of what he says. Just not always his final mixing decisions. But the quote that I like, when he was directly asked about Death Magnetic, and he said, "I may have provided more dynamic mixes, and they may have been rejected," which that sounds like political talk to me. But yeah. Anyway, okay, let me get back and check my list of... we still don't have Nirsa, who wanted to ask me a question or talk to me. I'm just going to check my email to see whether there's any kind of problem. There's no reply to that thread. So I will leave that answering that question a little bit longer. So let me see. I've answered the one by... answered that and that and that and that and that. No, I haven't answered that one. So I'll come to... Okay, so Tom asked, I was wondering if I should be compressing groups of sounds together before I send them to my main submix. So we're now talking about loudness in mixing. For example, kick, drums, bass, vocals, synths, FX. Should these have their own group with compression on, so that when they arrive at the stereo bus, I can have slightly more headroom and the stereo bus compression doesn't have to work as hard? I don't really have a categorical answer for that, Tom. There are different styles of working. You know, there are people who have a lot of processing on the stereo bus. They have an SSL bus compressor, or some people use multiband compression on the mix bus, and they rely on that as part of their sound. And there are other people who have nothing as part of that process. I don't think there's a right or a wrong way. I tend to have no compression on the mix bus when I'm mixing, and I tend to do all of that stuff in mastering, but I probably use quite a lot of compression in the mix itself. Either way is fine. If you want to experiment with mixing through a compressor, it is crucial. What doesn't work is doing a mix with no compression and then slamming some compression on it at the end. Well, I say doesn't work because that's what I do as a mastering engineer, but typically that doesn't work for... my whole thing as a mastering engineer is to try and achieve the goals that I want to achieve whilst being invisible. So nobody knows how I do what I do. So I've spent my entire career learning how to do that. The risk if you just slap a compressor on the end of a mix is that all kinds of things change that you didn't mean to change. You know, and you're effectively trying to teach yourself to be a mastering engineer in kind of half an hour at the end of the process. If you want to use compression on the stereo bus, put it in at the beginning of the mix through it, so you're always hearing what it's doing and you're making your decisions, your mix decisions in that knowledge. Which is better or worse? I mean, I do... Going back to the answer to the previous question about doing things in stages, for me, doing a little bit of compression in the mix and maybe even doing some manual gain rides with things like vocals, so that rather than just ramming it into a compressor, you're lifting levels by hand at some points and bringing it back at other points into the compressor, things like that, followed by maybe some gentle mix bus compression or some gentle mastering compression, followed by some limiting. I think small changes in increments are almost always going to be more successful than trying to do big changes at any point. So yeah, but when I'm mixing, I do like to bust the drums and put maybe a little bit of compression on them. I sometimes use a little bit of multiband compression on the drums so that I can get a compressed sound without having too much pumping or ducking going on. And yeah, having a stereo guitar group that you compress, I think it's a very common mixing strategy. I think it's definitely something to experiment with and see whether you can get results that you like. It's not to say you have to do it that way, but yeah, I do think that can be a good way of working. And I generally think that avoiding loading too much processing on any particular part of the chain is a good idea, because giving either a compressor, trying to get just a compressor without using a limiter, I think is a problem, because in order to get the control you want, you're going to have a very fast attack time. So then you have but very fast attack times with a lower ratio than a limiter, you're more likely to get side effects from the compression. So sharing the load between those two elements, I think, is better, and then sharing some of that load of the management of dynamics that you want in the mix is better. I mean, for me, when I'm mixing, I always try and get as close as I can to the final mastered sound as possible. The less I have to do in the mastering stage, the happier I am. But not to the point where I'm heavily limiting or compressing the mix bus. So I hope that helps. Joseph says, I have the new Dynameter plugin and it's working brilliantly. Fantastic. Really pleased to hear that. It made me think of something that may or may not have an easy answer. Is there a way to increase the dynamic range of a compressed track or song? I know a song might already be too smashed, but what if you got a track that was slightly overcompressed and you wanted to restore some dynamics to it? Or experimentally, if you got a -6 LUFS track and wanted to try and make it back into a -16 LUFS track, is there a way to do that? So there's two questions there. Yes, there are things you can do to stuff that has already been smashed if it hasn't gone too far to restore some life and some dynamics. Typically, the kind of thing that I do will be to reduce the level, probably use some EQ. If something's been really pushed really hard, it's probably lacking in punch in the bass end, so maybe a little bit of EQ can bring that back out again. It might sound a bit dull because of in the tie end, so maybe a little bit of EQ to bring that back out again. It sounds paradoxical, but sometimes adding a little bit of compression can add something. If somebody has used a compressor with a really fast attack time and kind of flattened everything out, using a compressor with a longer attack time so that when, say, a drum beat hits, it takes a second for the compressor to come in, you can actually bring some punch back to the beginning of the sound sometimes. The other favorite technique I have is just manual gain adjustments. So something that's quite common. I mean, usually if I get something that's kind of as smashed as -6, so as a PSR of 6 or less, the loudness is right up there. I would usually request a more dynamic version because usually there's very often a limiting or a clipping stage that can be taken off that will bring all of that back. And I mentioned this in a conversation with somebody else the other day. I think it's worth repeating here. In the times that I have done that in my 20+ year long career, I have never had anybody complain about that process. You know, when I say to somebody, this is smashed, can you give me a less smashed version? And they can, and they give it to me, I always get a result that I'm happier with. I always get a result that they are happier with. I have a 0 failure rate on that strategy. Do what you like with that information. For me, it's just evidence of everything that we're talking about here, that going too far is not a good thing. But what's more common, and where I might not necessarily request another version, is where, for me, there's just a little bit too much control in the mix. And there's not quite enough contrast between the verse and the chorus, say, particularly when I'm using extra processing in the mastering to maybe achieve what I want to do. So maybe the mix as it was fine, but once I've made my EQ and dynamic adjustments, the chorus isn't lifting quite as much as I would like. I'm very comfortable there using effectively automation to restore some, you know, and we're talking about changes of maybe half a dB or a dB, and it's amazing how much difference that can make. But just easing back the verse a little bit so that the chorus really kicks in, or if the chorus is over compressing heavily in terms of what was right for the verse going the other way, and sounds paradoxical, but you can reduce the level of the louder section so that it hits the mastering compression less hard and has that extra bit of life brought back into it, and it ends up sounding louder than it did before because it's less compressed. Little things like that can be used to help breathe new life into a mix that's kind of struggling. Now, the second part of your question, when you specifically said if we have something, hypothetically, something that was -6 and you want to get it back to -16 and restore those dynamics, the only time really that I've found that works is if you're talking about hard digital clipping. Because in terms of hard digital clipping, you can use something like Isotope RX, or I can't remember the name of it. There's a bunch of utilities out there where the aim is to undo the detrimental effects of clipping. Those can be very effective. And if they work, I remember one example in particular where I had a classical recording where a solo soprano voice had been digitally clipped. After declipping and reducing the gain to give it more headroom, it sounded pure again. All of the distortion was gone. I mean, I can't tell whether it would have sounded as good as the original, probably not, but it sounded far better than I would probably have anticipated. So that, in that situation, you might genuinely get some dynamics back. If that doesn't work, I don't think you can get something that's that good. You can add a dB or two of extra life back in using the kind of strategies that I'm talking about, but not to the extent that you're asking about there. One of the problems with the whole loudness war and all the rest of it is that, once the dynamics are gone, it's really hard to get them back. Now, that's not to say that 1 to 2 dBs isn't worth doing. My personal threshold is PSR 8. PSR 6 is only 2 dBs less. I have another blog post that I will do one day called "For a Few dB More," and I'll have to figure some kind of cool Clint Eastwood thing into it. But it really does, it's the loudness cliff. The difference between being at the summit and falling off the edge. You only have to go a little bit further and things go very rapidly downhill. And the same thing I think is true of loudness. So maybe that extra 1 or 2 dBs, if you can claw them back, is going to have a beneficial result. It depends on the material. It depends on, what kind of strategies you can use. But I would always prefer to go back to the source and get a less compressed version. I get a fair number of emails from people saying, what do I think of this declipper or that declipper? And we achieved wondrous results with this, that, and the other. And I'm interested in the sense that if it enables me to rescue somebody's recording and get a better result for them, that's exciting. In terms of trying to restore something back to an album that's been messed up at some point, I find it hard to get excited about that concept, particularly because I know what's going back is to one degree or another fake. I would prefer to go back to that original natural sound and get back to that. Of course, it's not always possible, but. And I think I'll do one more question and then we'll see if there's any more questions from people in the comments and everywhere else, because we're getting fairly late now. I'm probably going to wrap this up in about 15-20 minutes. So this last question here is from Anthony. He says, while I'm mastering with Ozone, I seem to get more noticeable results using the multiband dynamics, especially with the individual band's gain, either plus or minus, than I do with the EQ. Is it normal to have such a noticeable change in the sound due to multiband dynamics rather than due to EQ? And then he says, I tend to do the EQ before the dynamics, cuts only to minimize the effects, and then a little bit of EQ afterwards. I suspect maybe that there's two possible clues there. One is that for me, the reason to use cuts in EQ rather than boosts is that cuts have less effect on the overall loudness. If you do a cut of 6 dBs at a particular frequency and compare it with a boost at the same frequency of 6 dBs, the apparent increase in loudness because of the boost is greater than the apparent loss of loudness because of the cut. And we're just talking about EQ here, not level changes. So when you cut an EQ, you do feel that the level goes down a bit, but it's not as much as you feel the level goes up by boosting by the same amount. So that could be one reason why you're noticing a difference, the fact that you do a cut or a boost and where you do it in the process. Another thing is that if you EQ into a compressor, to some extent the compressor is going to fight against the EQ that you're doing. If you have a track where you've got a dB or 2 of gain reduction and then you boost the kick drum by 6 dBs, you're probably going to get 3 or 4 dBs of gain reduction because of that EQ boost. So that's going to reduce the apparent effect of that EQ boost. And I notice this myself when I'm working. I commonly use relatively large boosts and cuts. It's not at all uncommon for me to boost 4, 6, 8 dBs at particular frequencies in the mastering process, but that goes into the compressor, which then works against that. That's not to say that that's a different effect than just than having done less EQ in the first place, right? Because if you think about a kick drum, if you boost in those low frequencies, the compressor only has an effect when those frequencies that you've boosted are active, and the rest of the time the compressor doesn't work against the EQ. So there are subtle differences. That might be another reason why you're hearing less effect. But I think the other thing to say is that the changes to EQ after compression always have a more dramatic effect to me. So whereas I might be boosting by 3, 4, 5 dBs prior to compression, if I do any EQ ever after compression, it's usually like 1 or 2 dBs. Because the more compressed the signal gets, the more significant the, I guess the more percentage of the sound you're influencing with those boosts and cuts. So if you had lots of space and you EQ into it, you're EQing into some of the space in the sound, and you compress and you remove some of that space, then you're EQing, you've got less space to work on, and the changes become proportionally a larger part of the signal. I don't know whether I'm explaining that clearly. I'm kind of making this up as I go along. But now when you change the band gain, which you mentioned in a multiband compressor like Ozone, it's post compression. So if you, I mean, there's not really much difference between band gain changes. There is no difference between EQ. You're just, let's say you have a 3-band multiband compressor, bass, mid and high. If you lift the bass region by 1 dB post compression in a multiband compressor, that's like using a low shelf of plus 1 dBs. So you're effectively EQing it. And I think the difference is it's always post. So any changes made post compression will sound more dramatic than changes made prior. And I think that's why you formulated the opinion you have, probably, Anthony. So let's go back to see if we had any other questions kind of coming up because of things that I've said, things that I've, issues that I've raised. Let's have a scroll down through the list.
There were a couple earlier on that I jotted down.
Okay.
Julie J was asking, say that you've got the loudness / dynamics at an optimum level if a mastered track remains at the same level whether iTunes soundcheck is on or off.
I think I need to read that.
Which I think basically you could summarize by saying, should your target mastering level be the target that iTunes soundcheck uses to normalize to?
Ah, okay. Yeah, I understand. So let's say you master a song with a PLR, an overall peak to loudness ratio of 16 dBs. iTunes Radio and Soundcheck in Apple play everything back at -16 LUFS. They won't adjust the gain so that it causes clipping. So, and neither will YouTube. So in Soundcheck on iTunes Radio, because they're using a reference of -16, and because you've only got a range of 16 dBs between the peak and the loudness, the level won't be changed, and they will play it back pretty much at the level you mastered it. When you take it to YouTube, YouTube is using a reference level of -13, roughly. Remember, all of these things are just observations rather than concrete examples. So your master, which is down at -16, they want to turn up by 3 dBs to match their replay level. Now, if your peak to loudness ratio was only 10, they can play the song at -13. It will peak 10 dBs higher, which is at -3. No clipping will be caused, so they can lift your song up and play it at that level, and it will sound similar to everything else. But if you had a peak to loudness ratio of 16 dBs, so bigger, if they tried to boost your song by 3 dBs up to -13, it would cause 3 dBs of clipping. And YouTube won't do that. Spotify would add some extra limiting, which you may or may not be happy with. So this relates back to the earlier discussion I was having about using dynameter to optimize things for streaming playback. So your question is, would I say that the loudness or dynamics are optimal if iTunes doesn't change the level when you turn soundcheck on? It depends what you mean by optimal. It's optimal for iTunes, for soundcheck, because basically you mastered it at -16. iTunes wants to play it at -16, so nothing gets changed. But it wouldn't be optimal for YouTube if you had peaks going up to 0, because they wouldn't be able to turn it up by the 3 dB that they want to. So your song would end up playing 3 dBs quieter than other similar stuff. So if you want to optimize it for YouTube, you want to master it at -13 or with a peak to loudness ratio of kind of 12, 13 dBs. Spotify is higher again at -11. So, but they use limiting. So your track with a 16 dB peak to loudness ratio could potentially have 5 or 6 dBs of limiting applied to it by Spotify, which is unlikely to sound great. Now, I think I'll pause at this point and say that I have been part of an AES committee producing recommendations for streaming loudness. And we, after much debate, settled on a recommendation of -16, the same level that Apple have chosen for iTunes Radio and Soundcheck, as a good compromise between the broadcast level, which is -23, and Spotify's level of -11, which we just feel is too loud. -16 should mean that you can get healthy playback level on all portable media players, and the majority of material can be adjusted in gain to get consistent results. That's a great result for everybody. That's just a recommendation at the moment. I've got a Spotify have a forum where users can request feature changes, and I've got a request in there that last time I looked had about 250 people saying yes, this is a good idea, to reduce their level down to something similar to Apple, so that people, because if you want to achieve a situation where Spotify doesn't add extra limiting to your music, you've got to restrict the peak to loudness ratio to 10 or 11 dBs. That could be fine for a lot of material, but it might be less than you want to go to. And it's certainly going to be less than a lot of vintage recordings do. So there's a situation there where Spotify are kind of effectively forcing you to have extra limiting applied to your music that you don't want to do. And you're missing out, you're then wasting the opportunity of the extra dynamics that would be available to you on a platform like iTunes Radio. So ultimately, we would like all of the streaming providers to adopt a consistent level of -16. And then we all know that we can master our music basically however we like, and it will get played back consistently online. That's the ultimate goal. Who knows if and when we'll be able to achieve that. In the meantime, if you want, again, like I say, it depends what your meaning of optimal is. In terms of optimal, in terms of sound, you should just go for whatever dynamics sound best to you. If you like it with a peak to loudness ratio of 16 dBs, that's what you should do. But you're going to have to accept that on Apple Music, it's going to be played quieter than other songs. And on Spotify, it's going to have extra limiting that you didn't mean to be added. If what you mean by optimal is the best consistency between the platforms, it comes back to those guidelines that I was recommending earlier of don't go below PSR 8 because there's no point and you might damage the sound. But also don't let the overall peak to loudness go beyond 10 or 11. And as I say it, that sounds like a horrifyingly tight band. But actually, because we're only talking about the loudest moments, don't forget, the peak to loudness ratio can be as wide as you like in the quiet sections of the music because the loudness isn't down there and it's not going to trigger any gain changes. So at the loudest moments, the peak to signal ratio, the PSR, the short-term peak to loudness ratio, no less than 8, no more than 10. That's the short version. At the loudest moments, that will get you consistent playback levels across all of the streaming platforms that I've measured, give or take, bearing in mind that they all measure this stuff in slightly different ways. So to some extent, we're guessing. Do you think that answers the question, Ian?
Yeah, I think that addressed list it well. There's one other that I had from Jason Torres, if you're interested. Jason was asking basically about how you approach gain staging, which you've touched on a little bit, but kind of where you're adding gain through your processing chain. Do you use compression to add gain? Do you use any limiting to add gain? Just kind of how the gain increments, because you've said there are a number of masters that you do benefit from some added loudness, so kind of how that process works and what it looks like.
Yep. Okay. So I actually like to add my gain at the beginning of the process. This is something I go into a lot of detail on the home mastering masterclass course. So I can just kind of summarize it here. I like my mastering to be minimal. So that means I like to do as little as possible and for it to have as little effect as possible on the music. Doesn't mean I don't get my hands dirty when I need to, but that's that's my starting point. So I think the first thing that you should do when you're mastering is to lift the gain up so that the level is where you want it to be. So for the sake of argument, let's say you're going to aim for that. If your goal is to have consistent playback on all loudness platforms, then I think an integrated LUFS loudness of about -10, peaking no higher than -8, minimum PSR of 8, like you can see with dynameter, that's a good place to be. So you turn your music up to that level. If no further processing is required, if it's not clipping, and if it sounds great at that level, job done. Mastering's finished. It's just as mastered as any other song because the process is that final optimization process, but you've done the minimum and it sounds great. In all likelihood, you're going to need a little bit of at least limiting, possibly some compression, maybe some EQ tweaks, but you can only make those decisions when you've got the loudness right first. So the first thing to do is to adjust the level. Where you do that is not as critical. I actually like to do it with a gain plugin at the beginning of my processing chain. So in my mastering chain, I typically have level change, EQ, compression, possibly more EQ and or a little bit of soft clipping or saturation or tape emulation, those kind of things, and then a final limiter. You could use the limiter to boost the gain. But the nice thing about doing it right at the beginning of the process is you minimize the changes that everything else does as you go through. So let's say, just imagine if you use the compressor to boost the gain instead. Let's say you had a makeup gain of 10 dBs in the compressor, 6 dBs. The problem with that is that when you bypass the compressor, the level drops by 6 dBs. And the problem with that is our perception of the sound changes. Because the level is lower, we think it has less bass and treble than it actually has. So it becomes very hard to hear what the compressor does separated from the level change. Whereas if you boost the gain prior to the compressor, instead of having makeup gain in the compressor, so the compressor, when you bypass it, the level changes very little or not at all, it's much easier to make an accurate judgment of whether what you did with the compressor is beneficial. And the same thing applies at every point in the chain. So I like to get the gain right at the first stage in the process so that everything that I bypass after that, I'm hearing minimal changes. Any EQ change that I make, you know, you could add 6 dBs of EQ in the of gain in the EQ. But then when you bypass the EQ, you're hearing not only the EQ change, but also the level change, which is going to mess up your judgment of the EQ change. So for me, beginning of the chain, you have to be careful. You know, in modern DAWs, you've got 32-bit floating point or even 64-bit floating point processing. So you shouldn't have any problems with clipping, providing you don't clip the master output fader. But you might have some plugins in there, or if you're going out to a hardware, if you're going out of the box, where you could cause some distortion. So you have to be a little bit careful. But and in that case, all you do is you have a lower level going out, say, to the hardware processing or into the plugin, and then you boost the level later when you're back in the digital domain, and you can do that. But yes, for me personally, lift the level at the beginning, then you can bypass everything. You know, like my kind of default mastering setup would be 100% digital, Yeah, I know there's people who think that's sacrilege, but that's the way I was trained when I started out mastering. Digital was the new thing. For me, bringing in analog color is less common. I know there are people who swear by it, but well, anybody who, the unofficial slogan of my course is "It ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it." I think the whole analog digital debate is a complete red herring. We won't go into that now, but the nice thing about using an all digital chain is you know that if you've got 32-bit floating point all the way through, you can boost the gain, not have to worry about it, and then you can make those bypasses through the chain and hear everything as clearly as possible. You can go one stage further than that and use my perception plugin, because that will allow you to do a level matched bypass without having to mess around with what's in the chain, and at that point you can do pretty much whatever you like. That's even better, obviously, but you don't have to do that. If you're going to use that process that I just suggested, I think the one word of caution I would bring up is real analog gear could clip if you push the levels too high, if you send it out to some analog gear and bring it back, if you have the level too high to begin with. So could analog emulating plugins. So maybe something like the Waves SSL channel strip, any of the kind of tape saturation effects, all of those are calibrated to emulate analog signals, and analog signals expect loudness levels, average loudness levels of around about -18 LU. So if you're using that kind of process, the risk is that if you boost the gain at the beginning of the chain, you could be running all of those things much hotter than they were intended to be. You might like the sound of that, it might be cool, especially in a mixing situation, but it's something to be aware of. It's something you have to do consciously rather than by mistake. And if you have, say, an analog stage, the solution then would be to use the limiter to add the gain earlier on in the process. So you'll boost, I think, okay, so there's a short answer. Either boost right at the beginning or right at the end. I don't recommend boosting in the middle because it confuses your judgments about all of that processing that you've got in the middle of the chain. And be careful of real analog gear or of plugins or hardware that emulate analog gear, because they're going to saturate, or in some way similar the analog gear might. I can feel myself starting to get tired now, so I think maybe it's time to call it an evening, unless anybody has any last minute questions they want to throw at me before we sign off.
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or I should say, would you speak on filling out the frequency spectrum as far as loudness, and well, let me just say, like, I remember when I first started, I was trying to figure out master, and I'd get all these mixes in. It was horrible, just horrible. And say I might have, I'm just throwing these numbers out, say 500 hertz and below, a song, it would be, say, 500 hertz and below and 9 kilohertz and above, and then the middle, nothing. And they were wondering why the song wasn't loud, and why it was, say, eating up headroom or whatever. And then other mixes might come in with and it just has from 500 hertz up to 9 kilohertz, and then the other stuff is gone. But the point, and then that would be louder when I put them together. That would end up louder. But would you please simply speak to some songs are sparse, and they may have stuff out on the extremities, or it might maybe even in the middle. But the whole thing of filling out the spectrum and how, say, you might, am I making myself clear, or do I have to?
No, I think I know what the kind of thing you're asking. I mean, interrupt me if I'm not talking. So I've got a set of video tutorials called Home Mastering EQ, where I kind of talk about some of this stuff in detail. And one of the things that I talk about is this idea of balanced EQ. And balanced EQ is very important for loudness. In fact, there's a YouTube video where I do a demonstration. If I Google for EQ loudness, there it is. Hey, number 2 in Google. Nice. I'll just paste that into the comments of the event, if I can find them. Here it is. So that video demonstrates an effect where somebody sent me, they were asking why they couldn't get the kind of loudness that they were looking for. And the answer was they had an unbalanced EQ to begin with. It was exactly what you're talking about. Lots of lows, lots of highs, or maybe it was the other way around. But
or vice versa, yeah.
An imbalance between the mid-range and the bass was probably the most important thing. And what that means is that any compression that let's assume that they had too much bass. That means that any compression that you use is going to react mainly to the bass frequencies. So it's gonna, and especially if it's a single band compressor, it's going to duck out with every kind of kick drum hit or whatever, those higher frequencies where our ear is most sensitive and where we judge a lot of our perception of loudness. So what I do in the mastering of that video is to correct the EQ to improve the balance, so the relationship of the bass and the mid-range and the top is more balanced. And what happens is at the end you can get it to sound louder but using less compression than if you had tried to simply compress the original signal. So one of the concepts in the home mastering EQ videos that I go into is the idea of a balanced EQ, meaning not necessarily equally represented through the frequency spectrum, but certainly you don't want any huge lumps or bumps. You know, if you have a huge lump at 500 hertz or 2K or 60 hertz, wherever it is, or if you have a huge dip, that could be evidence of a problem. Now, the exception to that would be, say you've got an acoustic guitar, probably very little frequency content below 100 hertz and relatively little high up. And if you try boosting those to make the EQ spectrum look more balanced, you'll end up with too much bass and too much treble, so it probably sound boomy and brittle. So yes, the concept of balanced EQ is important, but it has to reflect the arrangement. If you have a mix that is just a pounding kick drum and a vocal, you shouldn't expect there to be a huge amount of content in that 500 hertz range or necessarily up higher. If you add a hi-hat into that, then suddenly you are going to have some more high frequencies in there. So you have to, I guess what I would say is that you can, I mean, one of the things I recommend in the videos is that you can use an analyzer to start training your ears. I'm not saying you should rely on it to make final EQ decisions, but you can. It's a really useful tool. So if you put something up and you can see there's a huge hole at 500 hertz, my suggestion is try boosting it. Listen to what happens. You know, you'll either get some nice warmth and a nice natural kind of feel coming back into the sound, and it'll sound less hollow and kind of brittle and metallic, or it'll start to sound kind of honky and, you know, telephone. Well, telephony is kind of higher up, but yeah, or it'll sound more hollow and kind of worse. So look for those things and listen for those things, and then just experiment. And over time, you'll start to develop an instinct for what is right and what's wrong. I mean, it was kind of fascinating for me to do the home mastering EQ videos because I knew people wanted me to do a product talking to them about EQ. And I mean, it happened all the time in sessions. I'd be sitting there and I'd put the song on and go, oh yeah, it needs a bit of this. And the client would say, well, how did you know that? And I'd kind of go, I just know. But what I realized as part of the process of doing the videos is that I didn't just know. It's something that I'd been given guidance on in my early days as a trainee mastering engineer, and that over the years I had evolved this instinct. And a lot of the early stuff was just about experimentation, was just about, okay, well, it looks as though this might need more 60 hertz. What does it sound like if I add more 60 hertz? Okay, it sounds better, or okay, it sounds worse. There will be mixes where you're trying to boost something and it's just not there. You know, well, bass is a good example. Let's say you have an arrangement with hardly any bass instruments in the mix. You know, maybe it's kind of got they're using a floor tom instead of a kick drum, so that the resonant frequency of that is maybe more around 100, 200 hertz than down at 50 or 60, where you might get a kick drum kind of really filling out. If you try and boost down at 50, 60 hertz region to bring some of that sound in, chances are you're going to get a load of kind of flabby room tone, or kind of unwanted reverberation and kind of you're boosting stuff that's not musically useful. So I'm providing you, well, that's why you have to kind of take the context into consideration. As a general rule of thumb, you want all of the frequency spectrum to be represented in a mix, but only if that is musically beneficial. So I think it's a process of, kind of listening, looking at what the meters can tell you, and then experimenting to see how that effect works, which sounds like it's the process that you went through, Matt. It's just over time you'll start to build up this kind of instinct so that it becomes more and more like second nature. Was that the kind of thing you were asking?
Yes. And Sigor and I were over here on the messages talking, because if you didn't address arrangement, we're going to ask you about arrangement. But okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, bro.
Pleasure. You're welcome.
And Richard Cooper just arrived, just to let you know.
Hello, Richard. We're just winding up. Did you have a question? Anything you wanted to ask? Oh, hang on. You're muted.
Yeah,
I'll just unmute you.
Okay, now am I there?
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, I was going to ask, because this feels like it's my final hurdle for as far as mixing is going. I'm a mixer, working on my own mixes a lot of times, but I work on a lot of other people's mixes and a lot of different kinds of music, which has helped out my own mixing, of course. But it feels like it's my final hurdle really to get to where I'm happy with my mixes, to make sure they're dynamic, so they breathe correctly. And I'm doing things on the overall mix to get certain things to have, a certain dynamic range. I'm just trying to get it to like a nice level. But the individual levels on the individual instruments is harder to compare. I'm finding it's kind of more difficult to rope in and find out exactly how much dynamic range some of these instruments should have. Like I know bass really doesn't have as much dynamic range, or it shouldn't. Ends up getting compressed to hell really in a lot of ways, compared to like a piano or a vocal or something like that. But what would be your way of telling me, I guess, to gauge the dynamic range on the individual instruments in the mix?
Good question. I think so. The first professional mix I ever did, I had one compressor that I used on the bass, and I had another compressor that I used on the vocal. It was an 8-track mix, believe it or not, because this was way back in the early 90s, and 20-bit digital was the new thing. And we had spent £10,000 or £15,000 on an 8-track 20-bit recorder. Sounds crazy these days, right? But and this was amazing. This was the thing. So, and we had sold this concept of a 20-bit digital recording and mix to the clients. So that's what we had to use. So I mean, it wasn't. I had more channels coming in on the mixer, but I did a submix of the drums down to stereo. Then I had bass, and most of the other instruments were mono, and it was. It worked out really well, and it had hardly any compression in it. I mean, if you're wondering why, that's because the recording studio that I was working in was basically it was set up as a mastering room, but also the MD of the company wanted somewhere to put his Steinway, so he built a live room adjoining my studio where the Steinway was, and then it was like, well, okay, well, we have this room, let's try and use it. So we kind of did some little recordings in there, and so it was a really minimal setup in terms of gear to begin with, and it got added to over the years, and I kind of came in right at the point where they're starting to do this. So I started, it's no wonder I'm a minimalist, given that that's how I started. But I still love that recording, I still love that mix, because it does have compression, but the compression is me working the faders. And that goes back to earlier on in this call where Matt was talking about how much he loves the early Michael Jackson mixes, and I mean so many of those recordings from back then. When you do your kind of homework on the history of recorded sound, nobody ever had more than 2 or 3 compressors. I mean, think how much an 1176 or a Fairchild costs.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. I feel that.
In that crucial phase, time of the recordings of all the classic things that we love, all of the processing was really minimal. So, in terms of the way that I learn, and I guess what I'm suggesting to you is to start with as little compression as possible and only use it when you need to, because what you'll find is as soon as you compress one element of a mix, it becomes more consistent, and as soon as it becomes more consistent, the variations in other elements of the mix become more of a problem, because if you've got a bass that's kind of there and nicely compressed and running through, and you have maybe a guitar riff that kind of chops in and out above it and in a similar kind of frequency range, if that guitar riff isn't also compressed, the risk is that the quieter notes will get lost beneath the bass. They'll be masked by the bass. So you compress that bass, and then you're tempted to compress the guitars, and then you've compressed the guitars, or you bring in a sound that's kind of naturally got low dynamic range, like a keyboard pad or something, and you want the other sounds to sit in the mix next to that, and you either have to ride them like crazy, which actually is what I would recommend as a starting point, or you have to compress them. And the problem is that if you're not careful, you end up where everything is compressed and suddenly nothing has any life, and you've got this kind of stodgy lump instead of a living, breathing mix, which is what you're talking about. So I guess what I'm saying is I can't give you kind of numbers.
Well, I wouldn't. I'm saying so much a number. I guess not I don't want to say like the exact you should have an exact dynamic range of 8 or something like that, or exact dynamic range of 12 or something like that. But I mean, I'm finding. I'm at the point where I'm mixing now, and I try to use compression only when I need it. Mm-hmm. Like I'll go into something when I think, hey, look, I got this one note that's bumping out, or I got this whatever. There's a part that's being unruly. Then I'll pull a compressor for that. But I max out on using maybe 2 compressors in a mix. That's I have a 76 that I use, and I use a 2A. That's really that covers everything I need. With all the prettiness that's out there, that really covers everything I need to be able to go off and do. Or so far. Mm-hmm. I'll get exotic one day and get some other cool stuff, but that really covers pretty much everything I need. But I hate saying, is it okay? But is it okay just to go off and get the dynamic range to be where get rid of the unruly stuff and not compress any further than that? So that, because I like dynamic range, I really love dynamics. Like I hate over compressed music. Mm-hmm. And I said the last thing I'm really trying to do is I really want to be able, I want those kick drums to really smash. I don't need them to be compressed to smash. I need them to go off and be able to hit right, to smash or to hit right with the dynamic range. That where I feel like I get more punch from having a strong dynamic range than by smashing it through a compressor. Yeah. Well, that makes sense to you because you know what I'm talking about. But I get. But should I do that, or should I approach it that way more, where I'm just trying to use the smallest amount of compression as possible?
Yeah, I think so. If that's totally. I guess the problem with saying yes to that is I could cause you a problem, because let's say you follow that process and you end up with a really super dynamic mix, and then you either decide to master it yourself or you send it to a mastering engineer and you want it to match certain other stuff that's out there in a similar genre that you aspire to sound like, and you can't achieve that because so earlier on in this hangout, I don't know whether you were watching and have just kind of joined in.
Just joined in.
Okay, so we talked quite a lot earlier on about the fact that it's not a good idea to try and do too much at once. If you start off with something super dynamic and then try and crush it down, that's kind of a recipe for disaster. So the risk of doing what you're suggesting is that you could end up with something that's really dynamic and then not be able to achieve enough control later on in the process to get the results that you're looking for without kind of unwanted side effects. So let me think of an example. Let's say you have completely uncompressed drums, which is what happened on the early Michael Jackson records and is what happened on Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Not uncommon at all. But that can absolutely work in a mix. In fact, Alan Parsons on Dark Side of the Moon, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that they wanted to use bus compression on the drums and he insisted that they take it off. So those mixes did have some stereo compression over the whole mix, excluding the drums. That can absolutely work, except the risk is that if you got it to the mastering stage and then wanted to reduce the dynamic range more for either control or loudness or for whatever reason, then you could get undesirable side effects from the processing that you use at that stage. So if you're using that methodology and getting a result that you're happy with, then fantastic, all power to you, and that's absolutely the way to go, in my opinion. That's tends to be how, I mean, my whole process of mixing is a bit like layers of an onion. You get an onion and it's got the scaggy outer dry up skin, so you peel that off, and the inside skin is pretty good, but it's got a little blemish, so you slice that off, and every layer you go in, it's more and more perfect, and the advantages of taking another layer of skin off are less and less, and it's just a case of how do you feel about any imperfections that are there. So for me, when I'm mixing, it's kind of throw the faders up, maybe go through the channels and just listen to see if there's any particular EQ things that need to happen straight away, and then try and get a rough mix with no EQ, no compression. And you then get to a certain point, and it's like you say, something is unruly, or something is not sitting right, or something is not working, and you kind of think, okay, I need to, and then it's, okay, do I automate that to make it sit better, or actually does it need a little bit of compression? And that's you just kind of go, I go round and round with that process of, okay, so now I've compressed the bass a little bit because it was a bit uneven. How does that affect everything else? Do I now need a little bit more somewhere else? And if you can follow that process and get to something where you're happy with the mix, and then you take it to the mastering stage, whether you do that yourself or you take it to someone else, and they get a result that you're happy with, you're good to go. And that, for me, that's a kind of an ideal way of working, especially if you're in, a kind of performance acoustic genre, as opposed to, say, building something from the ground up using loops or, electronica and stuff. Because in those cases, in a lot of senses, you're actually trying to create dynamics that weren't there originally.
I run into that sometimes when I'm mixing these different elements, where I have like a soft synth or something, and then I've also played acoustic to it, or I played a drum thing or whatever, and then add to a a regular vocal. It's just, I guess too, is it so? Would you find in the mixes that you do, just I guess for different genres and stuff, as a broad question on it, but do you find that certain or different instruments within the same mix will have a different dynamic range? Or would you say you try to get them all to have about the same dynamic range, the individual instruments themselves?
So the interesting thing is that I have, so I started working on about 20 plus years ago. And I was really lucky because I was trained up as a mastering engineer, but I also, because I was in this room with the recording room next to it, I got to do some recording and mixing as well. Then about 15 years ago, we moved buildings, and we then didn't have access to the recording studio. So I did far less recording and mixing from that point on. And now I hardly do any. It's only in the last 5 or 10 years that we've had tools like the TT meter and now dynameter. And the new gen have got stuff for analyzing dynamics. There's lots of new software out there that helps us examine the dynamics in a kind of concrete way rather than just trusting your ears. So the knowledge that I have about that kind of stuff is actually based more on the new kind of metering that we have. So in trying to answer that, I guess what I'm going to say is that, again, one of the first things I said on this hangout was that I was trained to use a VU meter to judge loudness. And one thing I do, I don't know about equal dynamics of every instrument, but it's not a bad thing. So when you're mixing, I would recommend you use a VU meter calibrated to -18. And then you get the VU meter you can use an emulation, plug-in emulation. So you keep the needle hovering around about 0. And as you add things into the mix, the level might start to creep up. So maybe you edge all of the channels back, or maybe you pull the master fader back, or whatever you do to keep it hovering around about 0. If you do that, you're really unlikely to clip the signal. You're going to be making good use of the available dynamic range. you're going to be in good shape. If you solo an instrument in that mix, it should still be visible on the VU meter. One of the things I like about the VU meter is it's most sensitive in the middle of its range. It goes from about -20 to +3, and you've got 0 at kind of the middle. So it really focuses on that. So if the VU meter is barely twitching, you probably can't hear it. And if the VU meter is slammed, it's probably too loud of a whole mix or of any one element. So, you kind of solo the instruments. And I think it depends on the arrangement. If the instruments are meant to be equivalent in the mix, let's say you've got 2 rhythm guitars, there's not many situations where you would want one rhythm guitar to be much louder than the other. And if you've got them panned hard right and left, you probably want the VU meters to be kicking around in the same area for both of them. And then you've got the drums and the bass and the vocals in the center of the mix. You don't want them to be pushing way louder or way quieter than the other elements of the mix. Yeah, so you kind of want that balance in terms of the level. And again, one of the things that we talked about earlier in the Hangout is that although you're not actually measuring the dynamics of the signal there, you kind of are, because the peak level when you get to the mastering stage is likely to be up near 0. So therefore it's the difference between the peak and the loudness, which you're measuring with a VU meter, that determines how you're kind of deciding the
reversing
dynamics. Yeah, you're deciding it in reverse. By choosing what the loudness should be, you're deciding what the dynamics should be. Because if you push it higher, it will push into any compression you have more and reduce the dynamics. And actually, that's a kind of an interesting, just to take a little tangent, that's an interesting thing that way that I work in mastering. Somebody was asking about gain structure earlier on and where I use the gain. I tend to do gain at the beginning of the chain. So rather than using compressors and pulling thresholds down and then having to bring extra makeup gain back into the system, what I tend to do is just push stuff harder into compressors and probably leave the thresholds pretty much where they are. So as you push the level up, you get more compression. As you pull the level back, you get less compression. And I do the same thing when I'm mastering. So that means if a song is quiet, it might get no compression at all. And if a song is loud and the chorus is louder than the verse, maybe it'll get more compression during the chorus than it does in the verse. And providing it sounds good, that's all good for me. And I do the same thing on channels in a mix. So, because that's, if you're, let's say you're trying to control a bass and you want it to sit here and it drops back. So you lift the gain up into the compressor, and that means that when it goes up here, it gets more compression and it holds it in, and it just kind of naturally, your threshold is up there somewhere. So you just, and the same thing applies to vocals. I mean, a great strategy that I think was always used back in the analog days and that gets lost in the digital age is the idea of riding vocal gain into a compressor. So I guess an important aspect of this is that for me, a compressor on a channel should always be post fader. Yeah, you have inserts on channels where you have the compressor and it can be pre or post. For me, I want to push a channel fader into a compressor because, again, that gives me the result that I'm looking for, which is if it's quiet, I don't need it to be compressed. That might mean that I use a few more gain rides for when it is quiet, and maybe I'm not hearing it quite as much as I like, but I'm happy about that. I would always, because I would prefer to be minimal, I'd prefer to do it with a gain ride than with a compressor usually. There are some things that always need compression, and you're absolutely right. When you try and combine acoustic sounds with electronic sounds, that's pretty much a recipe for needing compression, because most artificial sounds that you come across, if they're generated synth sounds or if they're sample libraries that have been heavily processed, chances are there's lots of compression in the raw sound. And as soon as you introduce a compressed sound into a mix, you get back to the thing I mentioned originally, which is that less compressed sounds might disappear below that sound or poke out above it. And therefore, you need to either ride them in a lot of detail or you need to use some compression to match it. So I've completely forgotten what your question was.
You got it. We were talking about the individual dynamic ranges between the dynamic range of the individual elements of a mix compared to the overall mix. If those things need to be balanced themselves. But you went into a whole bunch of other stuff that was really helpful as well. So that's freaking fantastic, man. Thank you very much.
That's cool. My pleasure. Okay, well, it's midnight. It's a Friday night. I think I'm going to go to bed. But thank you to everybody who's watching. There's still 43 people watching live, which is fantastic. And the replay will be available almost immediately on the event page. So anybody who joined in late wants to go back and watch the early stages, you should be able to do that. It will also end up being on my YouTube channel, and I will embed it in the blog post for this, that originally contained the information about this event, so that you can go back, and I'll be sending it out to my email list and stuff. So I hope you found some stuff that was useful and interesting. I talked about my Dynameter plugin at various points. If you're interested in checking that out, the URL is dynameterplugin.com. And for about the next 8 hours, you have the chance to get it at the introductory discount price. It's going to normally cost $99. It's available now for $69, so you save $30. There isn't a demo available, unfortunately, but we do have, we're completely sincere about having a 60-day returns policy. So if you're interested in playing around with it and seeing if it's something that's useful for you in the kind of ways that we looked at earlier on in the Q&A, then by all means, jump in, grab the introductory price, and if you decide it's not a good fit or it's not helpful for you, just let us know and we'll very happily refund you. If you want more information about that, there's a video on dynameterplugin.com which has a brief introduction to it. And if you go to my Facebook or Twitter accounts, I've been posting a few kind of screenshots and things as well that kind of help give you an idea of how it can be useful and how it can be beneficial. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions about that. As I say, the introductory offer is open till about 8 a.m. UK time, which will be about midnight on the west coast of the USA, I think. So you have a little bit of time to think about it if you're interested to try it out and play around with it. I hope you found something in here that was useful or interesting. Thanks so much for coming along and watching, and for all the great questions. Great questions make a great Q&A. And yeah, this was fun. I'm thinking I should do things like this more often. It's great to kind of connect with you guys and find out what the things are that I can help you with. So thanks very much. I always sign these things off by saying thanks for listening. So thanks for listening.